The Rebel Capitalist Show.
We went back and forth on Twitter there, and I'd love it if you could expand on your ideas, because I know you've given it so much thought on a debt jubilee with Japan. What really shaped my thinking, because I tried to think about that as well, and what really shaped my thinking is the interview you had with Dr. Lacey Hunt, where he was talking about the damage that is done when the government spends the money in the first place because it misallocates resources and because it, the malinvestment and the distortions of the economy. And by the way, I don't know if he brought this up or it might have been research I did for a whiteboard video, but back prior to the Fed, government spending was like 5% of GDP. Now, especially with 2020, it's gotten up, 55, 60% of GDP. So, I mean, you think about how detrimental that is. But my point is, in one of my videos, I use the example of a heroin addict. In that, let's say you give this guy a credit card for $100,000 and he runs it up buying heroin to become a heroin addict in the first place. Well, if you gave him a debt jubilee, where now he's got a credit card that's got a $100,000 balance again, he can go out and buy another $100,000 worth of heroin, but is he any healthier, or is he going to get less healthy? And that's kind of the way I saw the Japan situation, is they became a heroin addict. They're already a heroin addict. So even if they got that debt jubilee, as far as society as a whole, they would just get economically worse and worse and worse. But I know you were trying to think of it in terms of what would happen to the bond market, what would happen to the yen, and what would happen to some of those other, asset classes.
Right, because I sometimes like to think, like, if you're trying to figure out some macro imponderable, I like to take it to its ridiculous extreme one way or the other, and think about what the world would look like. So in Japan, the Bank of Japan has purchased roughly 50%, I think it might be even higher now, of all the outstanding Japanese government bonds. And so the question is, if they basically extinguish them, what would happen? And when I say extinguish, people can get confused. They say, well, their balance sheet, if they just, look, all they have to do is take all the bonds they own, trade them to the government of Japan for a 100-year piece of paper at 1 basis point. In other words, a worthless piece of paper. They still have the asset on their books, blah, blah, blah. So nothing changes away from that. Just the two entities agree, we're going to change the terms. So in the wake of that, what would happen to the stock market, the bond market, and the yen? I don't know the answer. I can see it. It occurs to me, Japanese stocks may rally. They may rally substantially because they say, wow, we got that debt off the books. And so now there's no danger of a debt collapse. It also seems to me that would take away the danger of the deflationary collapse as well, because you took that off the table. Japan is the original home of all these deflationary fears that people have. And of course, Japan's a little different from a societal standpoint than America. It's hard to compare because, we do have a lot of immigrants that come here and create businesses and help the vibrancy of our economy, and that's not true there. And their capitalism is quite a bit different than ours. Of course, we've bastardized ours pretty badly in the last couple of decades, but that's a different issue. But in any case, so then if you thought you knew what would happen in that extreme, then you'd have some roadmap for what would happen if look, I don't think the Fed's ever going to get these bonds off their balance sheet. They can't. So at some point, is that recognition going to be perceived as bullish or bearish, and for what assets? I don't know, but that was the genesis of the Japanese pulled it off. They monetized half the debt. They got it out of the way. They own all these stocks and ETFs. I don't know what that's going to lead to, but the fact of the matter is, if you'd have said to somebody in the 80s, look, this government, XYZ government, is going to monetize the debts, people would say, you're out of your mind. They'll never let them get away with that. Well, today they can. Does that mean that people back then didn't understand things? Or does that mean that people now have a warped sense of what's right? I don't know the answer. I have my biases, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, what I always go back to try to stay grounded when I'm thinking through this stuff is, if that is true, if there is no negative consequence to what Japan is doing or what we might do here, I mean, we're following down the same path, then there is a free lunch.
Yes.
And it really comes down to that question: do you
Yes.
believe it's possible to
Yes.
have a free lunch? Yes or no? And if it's no, then you've got to try to keep figuring out the end game, because there's got to be something. At some point you got to pay the fiddler.
You said it more succinctly than I did. I mean, that's the unwritten premise. Is there a free lunch or is there not?
Right.
And most of us that are involved in the markets know that the promises of socialism and communism never work because of human nature. We've all read Animal Farm, and we all know why it doesn't work. And we know, although there's a current generation of young people who don't seem to have gotten that memo in history class or the history of finance, but most people understand why it can't work. It's human nature. So in the same vein, the proverbial free lunch will just print up the money, and the money will still be worth what it was. And even though the new demands for constricted goods and services won't push them, there's no way that can work. It's not possible. But crazy ideas can work for longer time periods than people can tolerate. My favorite. So I mean, let's say they've gotten away with this for a decade, maybe 15 years of kind of the free lunch, and maybe it's about to end, and it went on for 10, 12, 15 years. You'd say, well, Jesus, that's a huge chunk of my life. Well, if you and I were standing around in the 20s, we watched what was going on in Russia, we'd say, this communism, this can't work. It'll never work. Well, it took 70 years before it didn't work. So you were right, but if you had been betting against it, it's a long time to be wrong before you were right. And so that's the part that I think we always have to keep in mind, is that, yes, 1 and 1 only makes 2, but people can decide it makes a different number for a long time. And you have to understand that and not be dogmatic about it. Must mean only 2 today, So that's the problem with these big, huge macro problems, is they go on longer than you think possible, and then they get crazier, and then it's much harder to be prepared when it finally is ready to end, because by the time it's it's when people have been convinced it can't possibly end.
Yeah. But then you and I wouldn't have anything fun to talk about.
Well, that's true.